Like all of you, I was so busy talking. Someone's like, "That's you," and I'm like, "Oh, never mind." And my last name is Chevet, but nobody ever gets it right, including, by the way, I was on French television, like the 6 o'clock news, basically. Wow, this is blinding. On the 6 o'clock news on national French television on election night, and it's French television in French with the French announcer, and my name is French, and he asked me how to say it, and I said, well, it's French, and then on air, he butchered it. And all of my French family in France was like, really? Really? So Americans get a pass, though, on saying my name. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here, to be back in Dallas, which actually is one of my favorite places. I was here in February and did a women's leadership event up the road at the Bush Center, which was a bipartisan women's leadership event the night before Super Tuesday. And we had the woman chief of staff of the Republican National Committee and the CEO of the RNC together to talk about how much women share across the aisle and the importance of women's participation in our election. And it was a really special event, and I have very warm and fuzzies about Dallas, and so I'm glad to be back. I'm really grateful to Mick for inviting me to talk today because, you know, the conversation around diversity and inclusion, which I know many of us have been a part of and have been leading in our organizations for a very long time, may never be more important than it is right now. And I feel enormously privileged to have the opportunity to talk about this topic right now. And I've been talking about it for many years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book and about why I wrote it. But I do think many of us feel that now is the most important time we may have ever had in our lifetimes to work on advancing greater understanding and inclusion in our country. And I think no matter where you stand in this election, that is something I'm sure we all in this room agree with. I started the journey to write Crossing the Thinnest Line about 18 months ago, and I did have some sense that this might be a complicated and divisive election season. When I started writing, it was not long after sort of the Black Lives Matter movement had begun to emerge. We knew that we were going to have one, maybe two women running for president, which in fact we did, and we need to remember there were two of them. Carly Fiorina was also in the race and made very important contributions. It was not easy for her, being the only woman on a stage of 17 men. That's something I think many of us can relate to, whether you agree with her or not. But I did have a sense that this might be a year where we would struggle as a nation to reconcile the transformation that our nation has experienced over these last number of years. I could never have known, nor could any of us have known, the extent to which that conversation would become intensified. That's a nice word for it. Intensified in this last year. And so my book, Crossing the Thinnest Line, which came out just a couple weeks ago, turned out to be more timely than I probably even wanted it to be. Because I wanted to, after having worked on diversity for many years, and some of you may have heard me here last year talking about the work I do on women's political leadership, which I'll talk a little bit about today. I've been working on diversity issues for a long time, and I did have this sense that we were in desperate need of a more thoughtful and open national conversation about diversity. And when I looked around at the books that were out there on diversity, most of them were really academic. They were written by professors at universities and sort of for people that do diversity for a living, but there wasn't really anything that was sort of targeting sort of all Americans to say, why does this matter so much and how much better can we do? And so that was my really small ambition with this book. So, you know, over the last year or so, I think one of the ways that we started to get a sense of the level of emotion in the country around diversity has been through social media. And weirdly, the sort of hashtags that are out there somehow managed to capture in just a couple letters and a hash sign all kinds of really complex emotions and feelings, all kinds of conflict and confrontation, all kinds of dissent and discord. And yet, I have been arguing for the better part of the last year that that is not a true reflection of who we are, that in a way social media is like a funhouse mirror. It amplifies some of the most extreme voices around us. And I've been really insisting on that. I've been insisting on it on national television. But I'm not totally sure it's as unrepresentative anymore as I thought it was or hoped it was. And I think maybe that's one of the things that many Americans, and again, this is not about the political spectrum, it's not about what side you're on. It really is about these kind of important questions about who are we? Who are we and who do we want to be as Americans? So I have to start in a dark place because the last few days have unleashed some really disturbing sides of our nation. The Southern Poverty Law Center has captured over 200 incidents just since Tuesday of racial assaults, attacks, aggressions around the country. One of the biggest segments of that has been in schools, in elementary schools and in high schools. There are stories all over the country of kids who are heading into their cafeteria and hearing kids shout chants of "Build the Wall" or "Go back home." That note on the upper left side, "Hey Maria, Trump won, so here's a little preview of what's to come." And it was a student in a Boston college who had built a wall out of shoes in their dorm room between their two beds and put this note on her bed. So it's an incredibly painful thing to confront because I don't believe that that is really representative of the majority of Americans. But because of the climate in this particular time, these kinds of confrontations have escalated. And I think it is a truth about where we are. The Jewish elementary school just outside of Washington in Silver Spring, near where I grew up, was covered in swastikas this week. There have been just an avalanche. My co-founder, Etta Coleman, who is African American, and her husband, Bernard, who was Hillary Clinton's chief diversity officer, were leaving their hotel on Wednesday morning in Times Square in New York City, which 95% voted for Hillary. In Times Square, as they were leaving their hotel, someone drove by and screamed at them, "Go back to your country." So, having spent my life working on diversity, feeling pretty optimistic about where we were, and feeling a sense that actually some of the best of what's happening in this country is actually happening in American companies, I've been sort of readjusting and as I think many Americans are, to try to come to terms with, really who are we? But more important, maybe more important even than these questions of how representative is this, and I do not believe that everyone who voted for Donald Trump in this election shares these views. I think many of them find this as deplorable as I do. But the question for me has always been, and it was, and I hope we'll buy the book, and you'll see that from the first pages, the question that I ask is, what can we do to do better? Because the United States is becoming a minority-majority nation. We have states in this country that already are. This is an inevitable transformation of the face and the spirit and the identity of what it means to be American. And so I believe, and this is why I wrote the book, I do not want to spend my lifetime fighting the same battles. I thought we were let me say that again. I believe we've made progress. And I'm going to talk about the progress we've made. But we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do to sustain that progress. So in many ways, the United States actually is doing extraordinarily well if you believe in diversity and think that's a good thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I think everyone should and what the dimensions of that are. But the truth is we are actually one of the most inclusive nations on earth. 62% of the college graduates in the United States today are women, which is a number I know many of you know. And across almost every discipline, women are outperforming men. I love looking at the charts, that chart on the left, which shows the progress. Sorry, the number's cut off, but it's back to that 0.10% is 1975. I love looking at that progression and seeing how far we've come just in my lifetime. I was born in 1975. So I love seeing that the labor force participation of women, really increased dramatically, that women are more able than ever to fulfill our hopes and dreams, that the doors of opportunity are open to us. And of course, I absolutely do believe that the advent of gay marriage is huge progress. And when I think about the attitude change in this country towards gay Americans in my lifetime, it makes me extremely proud. And a lot of that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it because I actually think it's really connected to the bigger picture of how we do better. Part of why Americans came to be so much more deeply accepting and understanding of gay Americans, of gay citizens anywhere, is because of one word. What is it? Love. People came out to someone who loved them. And it challenged and disrupted all the biases. And there are just countless stories of families that were transformed, of attitudes that were transformed, people who thought that they hated something, and then it turned out to be the life and identity of someone that they loved. This week, many of you have seen that the new movie about called Loving, which is about, which I write a lot about in the book. I write about the Supreme Court case that made it possible for interracial marriage to happen, and how much interracial marriage and the transformation of American families has changed attitudes on race and culture. But fundamentally, we change as we get to know each other deeply and meaningfully. The more we are connected to in deep and personal ways those who are different from us, the more likely we are to understand them and to feel empathy for them and to feel connected to them. So the truth is, we have done an amazing job on a lot of fronts, and we have to. Because as many of you know, and I think in the business world there's greater appreciation for this than in many other spheres, the demographics of our nation and of the global workforce compel us to pay attention to this, right? 89% of the college-educated or college-equivalent workforce around the world today is either female or multicultural. 89%, right? And millennials, who are 92 million strong, are the most diverse generation in American history. They are also the most highly educated. And if you want to get a sense of where the future of the country is going, which frankly is why I was so convinced that Hillary was going to win, as were many pundits, that when you look at the map of how millennials voted, the entire map is blue except for 3 states. And again, that's without judgment, but that is just to say that for whatever reason, younger Americans are committed in some very deep ways to a more inclusive view of the country. And of course, the gender gap, which does persist, is one of our biggest economic assets. The numbers are astonishing. Remember, I talked about that labor force participation rate of women, which has increased steadily since the 1970s. Well, in the last few years, for the first time in my lifetime, that number has begun to drop. And we are seeing women leaving the workforce at greater numbers. And we could talk all day about why, and I'm sure we all have theories about it. But the fact remains, were we just to close the gap in the labor force participation of men and women in this country, we would add $5 trillion to the American economy. That is 5% GDP. In an environment where we've basically had 1 to 1.5% GDP growth for the last however many years, that's a big number. Can you imagine anything else that would add that much to the American economy that we wouldn't be spending a lot of, if there was anything else, wouldn't we be putting all of our resources behind deploying it? And yet somehow that one doesn't even really make it into the conversations about how to grow the economy. But here's the thing. The numbers are in, the data has been proved. There is an absolutely overwhelming, compelling correlation between diversity in leadership in our businesses and better financial performance. Period, full stop. And the thing that's really changed is that when I started working on diversity, 10, 12 years ago, it would be some small, kind of not very well respected, diversity organizations that would do these numbers, and all the bankers would be like poo-pooing it and say it doesn't really mean anything. Well, now you've got Credit Suisse that's done, 2 major longitudinal studies on this. You've got the Peterson Institute, you've got the World Economic Forum, and everywhere that CEOs go now, they are hearing about the economic case for diversity, why it makes such a difference to business performance. And I'm not going to go through all the reasons why, because this is a room full of 99% women. You already know the answer, so I don't need to convince you. Yes, having diversity of thought leads to better innovation, market growth, lower risk, et cetera. So I just did it even though I said I wouldn't, but I can't help myself. It just rolls right off the tongue, there might be one person in here who hasn't heard this before, so I have to say it. So look, we gotta do better. And we have to do better, not just for the country, but for our businesses. I mean, in every corner of American society, the case for improving our ability to deploy and engage and unleash the power of diversity is so overwhelmingly compelling. So I'm going to stop talking about data for a second and just talk about me, because I'm up here. And just to tell you a little bit about my life. And I talk a lot about it in the book. And I did feel that writing a book on diversity as a white woman, that I needed to say something about how I come to this story and how I come to this passion. And I say in the book, I'm not Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is maybe the most obvious thing you've heard all day. But I did feel that I needed to say something. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is one of the most diverse cities in the nation. In my childhood, it was about 95% African American. And many people don't know or don't think about the history of slavery and segregation in Washington, but it is a long and painful one. It was part of the Jim Crow South, and Michelle Obama was right that the White House was in fact built by slaves. And so Washington, in my childhood, was a very complex but extremely rich place to grow up. And looking back, I feel profoundly grateful, because in all of my classes, in all of my experiences and everything about my life, I was immersed in communities of people who were different from me. And not just racially different, because it was heavily African American, but all the embassies of the world are in Washington. And so, in kindergarten, there was always there were 12 nationality, they'd go through you'd learn a different language every morning to say good morning. And that had a profound effect on me. But in the 7th grade, something happened that really changed me forever. I was sent to this very exclusive girls' school in Potomac, Maryland, called the Holton Arms School. It was a big deal that I got in. My parents were thrilled. My mom was a big believer in single-sex education and uniforms, which is like a whole other part of this. She should have known that the uniform was never going to work for me. But really what happened was that early on in the 7th grade, one of my classmates, one of the most popular girls, had sort of like the first big birthday party of the year. And the entire class, I found out, was invited, except for me. And I went home to ask my mom, in tears, why wasn't I invited to this party? And it turns out, and I guess she had heard this from some of the other parents, it turns out that the party was being held at the Chevy Chase Country Club. And I know there's some Washingtonians in the room. But in 1988, the Chevy Chase Country Club still excluded Jews. The only Jewish member that anyone knew of was Henry Kissinger. And it turns out that was why I wasn't invited. So my mother, I don't know how many of you in the room are Jewish, but no good Jewish mother loses an opportunity like this to recount the entire history of the oppression of the Jews, which she did. But also that my own grandfather had to change his name from Goldberg to Gilbert in the 1950s, because in huge parts of America, he couldn't get a hotel room with a Jewish name. Kind of amazing to think about. The town of Chevy Chase, where the Chevy Chase Country Club is, which is literally right on the border of Washington, it was a walking distance from my own house inside the district, was actually established to be a white enclave. And in fact, these are the articles of incorporation for the town of Chevy Chase. And it makes clear that no lands, interests, et cetera, will be sold, leased, or in any way used or occupied by any person of the Negro blood or to any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, et cetera. Right? 1988, the Chevy Chase Country Club still excluded Jews. Now, the good news is they don't anymore, and I actually know lots of fabulous, amazing, interesting Jewish members of the Chevy Chase Club, and they've deeply committed to having changed that. But that experience was so humiliating and so frustrating. And the sense of powerlessness that went with that was one that I will never forget. And it's not that I think that I then in some way have any less bias than anyone else or understand in some other way what it's like to be a visible minority in this country. I can't. I never will. There are experiences of being a visible minority that I will never have to deal with. But it did make me want to make things better for anyone who felt excluded. And when I got to high school and we were, confronted with a lot of racial issues, I really experienced it in a different way. And my whole life, I have felt this sense of just absolute inability to tolerate injustice that's based on things people can't control. But I actually think that this ability to empathize with and understand and in some way care about the experiences that others have, whether or not they are our experiences, might just be one of the most important things we need to do as a country. Those are my kids. That's the little one is Serena, and the older one is Stella. They're 14 months now and 7. And, I had to really confront, as the mother of African American girls, my own remaining biases. And I will always have to do that. But the fact is, I know that all of us want a nation for our children and for our friends' children and for all children where the opportunities are limitless and where everyone can really fully experience the American dream. So here's the thing. We have a lot of work to do. And it's not just about some of the obvious stuff, like voting, and we'll get to that in a second. But 70% of Americans in poverty are women and children. I talked about the labor force participation. We have 2.7 million children in the United States with parents in jail. And a huge part of that community, and I think we can't talk about diversity in this country without also talking about what's happening with mass incarceration, because we are locking up a massive proportion of our future diverse talent pool, right? One of the reasons I called the book Crossing the Thinnest Line is I met these amazing colleagues of mine. Some of you know that I do some work with Deloitte. I work on diversity issues with American companies through a partnership with Deloitte. And a couple of my colleagues from Deloitte we were at lunch in Boston. And these guys are like central casting, white, Irish Catholic, Boston guys, down, Red Sox fans, like Goodwill Hunting, okay? So you got the visual. And we were sitting at lunch one day, and somebody walked by, and they had this sort of mystery conversation that I didn't really get. And I asked my colleague Brian, it was Brian and Sean, and I asked them, what was that about? And it turns out that Brian and Sean are part of a program in Boston led by the brother of a senior executive at a big Boston company who is a priest. And they take pretty much exclusively white male Boston executives from big companies into maximum security prisons in the Boston area. And the thing that Brian said to me that day at lunch about his experience of going into prison, because of course I asked, what's that like? The thing he said to me blew me away. And I went back and I changed the title of my book an hour after lunch. He said, the thing I've learned visiting these prisons is that the line between us is so very thin. And I thought, God, how is that true? And he said, look, I was kind of a bad kid. I got into trouble. I didn't follow the rules. I skipped school. I was smoking pot on the corner. If I had had even one less opportunity than I did, I could have been one of those guys on the inside. And if one of those guys on the inside had had one of the opportunities that I had had, they could be where I am. I was so blown away that he saw it that way. And it turns out that Brian is not just wasn't just like that it changed his attitude. He actually went back to work at Deloitte and has become one of the biggest champions in the Boston office for diversity. He's gotten involved in the Women's Network and the Minority Network. He's doing diversity events with his clients. He's actually working on this because he was personally impacted and changed by this experience of crossing lines, of discovering this intense common humanity, which I think is so important. So here's the thing, if we want more Americans to be able to do that, we have to work on it. And one of the realities of the country today is that we are intensely segregated. There are huge communities of Americans across the country who live in entirely homogeneous neighborhoods, who go to totally homogeneous schools. And this chart shows the progress of school integration since Brown versus Board of Education, which was in 1954. And look at the line. It's become a bell curve. We are actually losing ground. And kids today in public schools in America are actually more likely to go to a segregated school than kids in 1991. Right in my own city in New York, there's a huge fight that's broken out on the Upper West Side because there is a public school, there are two public schools 2 blocks apart. One was districted around a housing project, which is almost entirely African American, and one is districted around a condo that is almost called Lincoln Towers, which is almost all white. And the city is trying to rectify this because those 2 schools that are a block apart are almost all black and almost all white. And Brown versus Board of Education, our Supreme Court said that separate is inherently unequal. And yet, as the Board of Education, and this is right now in New York City, 2016, as the Board of Education has tried to integrate those schools by switching the zoning lines, a massive fight has broken out among the liberal elite Upper West Siders who are screaming bloody murder that their kids may have to go to a different school. Right? There are tough decisions we have to make, and the truth is that this school issue is not just about creating equal opportunity for the for the minority students in those minority schools. All the data shows that when you are in a diverse environment, you learn better, which means that white kids actually do better academically and intellectually when they are in diverse schools. And we all know this to be true at work, right? That our game is inevitably raised by being challenged by people with different perspectives around us. So shouldn't we be doing this in our schools? Don't we need, in a nation that's going to be minority majority, don't we need our kids to understand how to build relationships of understanding with one another, how to learn from each other, how to connect with each other? So I'll just hit on a couple other things before, because I want to make sure we have time for conversation. I talk about a lot of different things in the book, but a bunch of things are connected to our ability to understand one another, and the media is one part of it. I mean, our media and Hollywood, forget about the Oscar so white controversy. I know we all heard that there was progress. Let me make it easy for you. There has not been progress, okay? They definitely did better in terms of diversifying the Academy. Cheryl Boone Isaacs, who's African American, has been deeply committed to this, but 94% of the studio heads in Hollywood are white men. And that is not inherently bad, except that 60% of the viewing public is female. And it turns out that the films and television shows that actually are oriented towards or include more women and people of color actually do better, but they don't get greenlit. They don't get the opportunity. One of my favorite things, which I know you'll remember because it's kind of entertaining but sort of horrifying at the same time, there's something called the bed shell test. Now you're all going to be looking for it next time you turn on the TV or watch a movie. The bed shell test basically measures how often a woman on film gets any of the following things. So is there more than 2 named women in the film or show? Do those women have any conversation of any kind at any point? Okay? And then the third is that conversation about anything other than a man? Okay? Half of all films in 2015 failed the bed shell test. Half. Kind of amazing, right? But there is some progress being made, and we all know, on awesome shows, all the Shondaland stuff, and my dear friend Alicia Reiner, who just did a movie called Equity, which was the first ever female-driven Wall Street film, written by women, starred in by women, directed by women. I went to see it with some friends, and my friend's husband, who went to see the movie with us, said it was a great movie, but the male characters were so thinly drawn. And of course, we all burst out laughing because, tell us about it, So anyway, one little thing, because I always like to say things you can do. I was watching Bill Maher last night. My favorite part of the show, and I love Bill, but last night he had 6 men on the show and 1 woman, and they started talking about why Hillary lost the female vote, and the one woman was asked to talk, and then all 6 men talked over her immediately, and she literally never finished her sentence. So when that happens, I tweet something called Gender Avenger, which you should all check out on Twitter. Gender Avenger actually is measuring the representation of women on film and television and news shows and, trying to put some pressure on Hollywood. So anyway, sidebar on things you can do, but also go to movies and turn off shows and tweet at these shows when you don't see any women on them. I mean, really, 5 men and 1, anyway, you get the point. Okay, so look, the workplace in many ways is the most promising of all. We have made extraordinary strides in American companies. And 34% of the pipeline layer to top leadership today is now female, 27% multicultural. We now have 38% of American women are primary breadwinners. By the way, I always love to do this. How many people in this room are primary breadwinners? Okay, keep your hands up, look around. Yeah, I would say that's a little bit more than 38%. Pretty amazing. It's a radical transformation in terms of what's happening in this country. And, this was a little shout out to you, Nina. Sorry, I had to call her out because she's one of my favorite people. The United States is also one of the best places in the world for women entrepreneurs. We've got 8 million women entrepreneurs, almost 6 million minority-owned businesses. So a lot of great things are happening, and yet these numbers, which you guys all know by heart by now, right? Who didn't know these numbers? You've all seen this before, right? 4.2% of Fortune 500 CEOs. This number has basically not changed in a decade. All 4.2% of them go to Nina's conference. You can see them all there, right? They're all there. They fit in a relatively small room, unfortunately, right? 7% of top corporate earners. This is the kind of thing that is the work that remains to be done. But what I would argue is that in many ways, the work that's left to break these final barriers is all about this question of crossing lines, of this ability for us to relate to one another and to start to understand each other and to take seriously the unique challenges and experiences that we may face. And I talk a lot about that in the book and about especially, I think, the outsized role that white men have to play. Because as long as they are in the roles of power and authority in our businesses, they are also have enormous power to make change. And I tell a lot of stories about amazing male leaders across the country, men like Warren Buffett and many others, who are taking this challenge very seriously. And I'm enormously optimistic about what I see in business, because I think that men in business care enormously about this topic and want to do better. They don't always know the answer, but they want to do better, and that's progress. So I know I'm running low on time, but I can't leave without talking a little bit about the election. Women have turned every election in this country since 1980. Every single one. And they turned the election on Tuesday. 43% of American women voted for Donald Trump. 43%, okay? But 93% of Black women voted for Hillary. Part of why he won is because such a huge percentage of white women, and I think you guys mostly have heard this now on the news, and heavily white women without college degrees supported him in very significant numbers. But the biggest factor in this election, and I don't care where you stand or who you voted for, 49.3% of registered, eligible American voters did not show up at the polls. It was the lowest voter turnout since the year 2000. The lowest voter turnout in 16 years. So how does this happen, right? And I spend a huge amount of my time, many of you know that I founded something called All In Together, which is focused on mobilizing when we are nonpartisan. We support women on both sides of the aisle, but we are focused on getting women to mobilize and get engaged in the political process. Because if we want our interests represented, whatever your interests are, and we do not all agree, American women are as diverse as the nation. We don't all agree politically. We don't agree on the same social issues. We are as diverse as the nation. But fundamentally, we are giving away our voice and our power because we are not participating. And we do turn those elections, so we are the deciding factor in elections, but then we are not holding our leaders accountable once we send them to office, right? 20% of the Senate is now female. There was zero progress in terms of the numbers in the 115th Congress, even though there were some very high-profile women who won. Net balance, just like those 4.2% of women in CEO roles, we add them, but we lose them just as fast, and so we don't actually change those numbers. This is one of the most shocking statistics of all. The United States is 74th in the world for the political participation of women. Guess what countries are ahead of us on that list? That's your turn. Just shout them out. Canada, Sweden, India, what else? Britain. So it's not just the countries that have female heads of state, by the way. Tunisia is ahead of us on this list. Rwanda, South Africa, the Philippines. I mean, there is a long list of countries, because 73 of them to be precise, who have higher levels of participation than we do, even without having had a woman as their head of state. We think of ourselves as the greatest democracy in the world, the example to everyone of what democracy should be, and yet we're number 74. And by the way, in 2015, we were 54th. So we have dropped. Wrong direction, I would argue, right? So we have to step up. And I really believe that it is American women that are going to drive the change in this country for the future. And I really believe that women, and I could talk about this all day long, what is true about women, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are, is that women invariably want to do good as well as do well. When we become successful, when we have opportunities, as all of us in this room do, we do want to use that for good, to make the country better. Most of us, though, don't see political participation as a way to do that. We volunteer at our churches, we get involved in our schools, we might, do something in our community. We do not see political participation and leadership as a way to make the country better. We have to. Because if we do not get in that game, if we do not play the game, we cannot change the game. And I think we would all agree, again, no matter where you stand in this very complicated and emotional election year, women need to be better represented. Our voices need to be represented in all the halls of power in our nation, whether that's the halls of business power, whether that's the halls of political power. We cannot afford to let any of those go, but it's up to us. And I do believe that women have an extraordinary and unique ability to break boundaries, to have compassion and empathy for people who are different from us, to build consensus and understanding, to lead with heart, to put the interests of the nation ahead of our own egos. And by the way, and I know I'm running long, one of the things I say, and I'll say this to rooms full of men, how many of you believe that our political process is broken or that Congress doesn't get anything done? Yeah, so it's at least half the room. The number one thing that you can do if you want a better functioning democracy is you either run for office or you support a woman running for office. Because when women get to political office, and this is now proven with data, people, I can prove it, it's not just my hunch, when women get into public office, they are more likely to be bipartisan, they are more likely to forge consensus. Guess what? They get more shit done. Big surprise there. They pass more bills. And they are just fundamentally more effective. I don't care who you are. If you believe in a better functioning democracy, we need more women in office at every level. And I, as a lifelong Democrat, now you probably guessed it already. It's hard to hide. I, as a lifelong Democrat, have started giving money to Republican women running for office. Because in a two-party system, I believe in the power of having diverse voices, and I want to support women who run, even if I don't agree with them on every issue, right? And I know I stood up in front of the Democratic National Committee and told them that, and I thought I was going to get the hook, but they were very kind. After they gasped, they let me continue, but I do. So look, we have got to cross more lines as a country. We desperately need this. We desperately need to be examples to our children and to all Americans of how we find ways to understand each other more deeply and more meaningfully. I don't care if you understand or relate to the experience of someone in this country who is hurting right now, or is afraid or is worried for the future. You don't have to believe it. If any of our fellow citizens feels that they cannot fully experience the full promise of the American dream, it is up to all Americans to make that better. We are all in this together. It is up to all of us, whether we agree with it or not. It is incumbent on all of us to make it better for any of us who feel that they do not have a place here. And that's an unacceptable reality. So with that, I'd love to open it up to some questions and comments. I know that was a little heavy for a Saturday morning. But I'm really inspired, and I'm really inspired to do better. And it really rests on rooms full of women like all of you. So thank you. Yes, please.
Hi.
And please introduce yourself.
I'm Lisa Paul with Quoney Destination Management. I'm a WINiT founding leader and a 2017 board member. I do have a question, but I first just wanted to share some exciting news with my WINiT family because we're all here to celebrate each other. So it's a kind of a shameless plug for my family, but it's a relevant piece of good news. My cousin is a television director, and he directed The Daily Show for many years.
Oh, cool.
And when Samantha Bee was given her new show on TBS, she handpicked my cousin, who is a male, we won't hold that against him, to be her director. And it was just announced on Time Warner's shareholders call last week by Jeff Bukes, the chief executive of Time Warner, that for the first time in the network's history, a female-hosted show has exceeded the ratings over all of their male-hosted shows in every demographic.
Awesome.
So please, if you've never seen it, it's on Monday nights on TBS. It's called Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. Samantha was one of the correspondents on The Daily Show, and TBS has given her own show. And the writers some of them are Daily Show writers, but they are brilliant. Samantha is just has a heart of gold. How many have seen Full Frontal? So please watch, for those of you who haven't, Monday nights.
I do Soul Cycle with her twice a week. It's like my favorite highlight of my week. Oh my God, and I'm such a geek. Every time I see her coming, I'm like, hi Samantha, I love you. She's like, shut up, I'm getting to the bike. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
So anyway, I do have a question, but I just wanted to share that with everybody. Obviously, you mentioned the relevancy and the timeliness of your book and the divisiveness that we're seeing right now in the country. And you just gave us some closing words of how we can help to change things. But in realistic terms, in the short-term near future, do you really see much change happening now, considering what has happened with these election results?
Well, I guess some of it depends on how do we define change. And, I do want to say one thing that I think is really important, because you talked about Samantha, and I do love her show, and, think of her as a friend, and I really admire her. One of the things that I believe many of those on the left failed to do in this election was have real respect and understanding for women of a different political persuasion and background, and for women who did not see Hillary Clinton as their candidate, for pro-life women who vote often along those lines. And I've spent many years thinking about all the things that have gone wrong in the women's movement. And when you look back over everything that, whether it's the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment or any number of things, many of those failures was because liberal women discarded and discounted the perspectives of conservative women. I have had a massive and radical personal transformation around this because I founded a nonpartisan organization. And I will tell you, I didn't have any Republican friends. I didn't know any. I grew up in a neighborhood that was all Democrats. I went to live on the Upper West Side. I went to Columbia University. It was like a unicorn. Like I'd never seen one. I heard about them, but never knew one. And I had to go out and really work hard to build relationships with Republican women because I needed them and I needed their perspective. And I have learned a lot. It has changed my life to have these deep and meaningful relationships with people who are of different political orientations than me. And so I know many of us love Samantha. She has a very particular political bent, as do a lot of the most well-known women out there who I worry that we are failing to recognize and understand that there are many very smart, educated, thoughtful women in this country who have different views, right? We are not all the same. We do not all agree. So that's one point that I really felt like I wanted to make, because I didn't make it earlier, and I usually make the point to try to do it. And by the way, I mentioned Dallas. I had the opportunity to meet President Bush a couple years ago, and I wrote about that in the book. And I came here to Dallas. I was freaked out. I'm like, oh my God, there's gonna be some kind of alarm at the door of the Bush Center. They're gonna know the Secret Service is gonna come. They're gonna say Democrat on premise, and they're gonna like yank me out. It was ridiculous. He was the most gracious, loveliest person I think I've ever met. He blew me away, and it really transformed my view of him. Now, I still don't have the same political views, but on a human level, it really changed my perspective. And so when you ask me about progress, there's just an infinite list of things that I think we should make progress on, and I write a lot about them in the book. There's policy things we need to do, there's political things we need to do, and I could give you a list a mile long. But at the end of the day, some of this is really going to come down to our ability to just have a maybe uncomfortable conversation with somebody that we think we have nothing in common with. And I would really challenge everyone in this room to go find someone who voted a way that you did not, and have a really open conversation with them, and find a way to connect, as hard as that is. If we continue to isolate ourselves in the MSNBC and the Fox News bubbles and refuse to try to understand the intentions and perspectives of people who have different views than us, I don't know how we make progress. And we liberals, me liberal, I'm guilty, right? We're all guilty of this. It's hard. It's hard to do. It's uncomfortable. But I don't know how we make more progress as a nation on any of these goals if we can't even just do that. So I could talk about it all day long, but thank you for a really lovely question. I know I'm getting the boot. One more?
We'll need to continue on in the breakouts.
Okay.
So the good news is this.
I'm leaving. Sorry, I'm going.
That's the bad news. The good news is that Lauren is part of one of your two options for the breakout, so anyone who would like to continue that dialogue. But thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you.
She's a consultant at Spencer Stewart. Please welcome Linda Roby.
I tell you what, I'm just so privileged that my incredibly eclectic career path has brought me to the world of executive recruiting, where I get to spend every day finding women who are ready to step into the boardroom and into C-suite to help really make changes in business. We know that they drive innovation more quickly, they have more engaged employees, and results are better. And every time I spend energy finding a woman who's ready to step up and step in, I know that the choices ahead for my daughter will be even bigger and brighter than they are for us in this room today. So now, on to a case study in momentum, Barbie and my daughter. Let's see, my childhood Barbie was a plastic doll with thousands and thousands of plastic shoes. And in this age of digital and content, I've gotten to know Barbie, my daughter's Barbie, as this woman with this phenomenal pioneering spirit. She's relentless, and she has had so many careers. She's a veterinarian, she's a nurse, she's an inventor, and she is a prolific entrepreneur. And I was playing with my daughter the other day, and Barbie called me on the phone, and she asked me, "Hi, do you want to go to the beach with me today?" And I said, "Barbie, the beach? I hadn't thought about it, but if you think that I'd have fun at the beach, yeah, Barbie, I'll go with you to the beach today. Thanks for calling me. I'll see you soon, Barbie." And I handed the phone over to my daughter, and my daughter said, "Oh, Barbie, I can't go to the beach with you today. Today, I'm opening my nail studio / horse training studio. Maybe you and your friends can come by later and help support my business." I'll tell you what, she has it right. Okay, this is what I see every day now. Women who believe in and understand the power of positive attraction are the ones that are there today. They've chosen the path that they want, and they've set their vision. They visualize the steps that they need to take to get there, and then they tell people about it and they ask for it. So I encourage each one of you, when you're looking to find momentum, to make sure you answer, but then also make sure you ask. Thanks.
She's dedicated to producing enduring stories of outstanding achievers who understand that what matters most is impact. She's a member of the WINiT Advisory Board, founding partner of Sellers Easton Media, chair of Fortune's Most Powerful Women International Summit, and a Fox News commentator. Please welcome Nina Easton.
Yes, Lauren, I'm a commentator with the dreaded Fox News, my good friend. And I live in that part of Chevy Chase where Jews were allowed. First of all, can we give a round of applause to Mick Lee, who is all about impact and all about making a difference. And this is incredible that she produced this and the level of this influence. So I'm going to be brief because I know we're a little running out of time, and we can continue our conversation over breakouts following this if you like. I, as the announcer said, the voice of God as we call it, I wear a lot of hats, but one of them that I deeply cherish is that I'm chair of Fortune Most Powerful Women International. It's a series of events in Hong Kong, in Europe, and in the United States. As Lauren mentioned, it's sort of focused on that 4.8% of women who are Fortune 500 CEOs, but it's about C-suite women and top names in government, in whether it's the Senate, the White House, state level, and women in all sorts of walks of life, entertainment and so on. And I just wanted to offer a couple observations that I took some time to gather when we were at our last summit just a few weeks ago at Laguna Beach, because I had the honor to sit next to Barbara Streisand at a green room table, sitting right next to her. She was about to go on and be interviewed by my business partner, Patty Sellers, who founded Fortune Most Powerful Women. She was about to go on stage, and she was about to talk about women's health and some other issues. And she was sitting there with her cards, and she was literally shaking and nervously scrawling at these cards and showing them to her assistant and scrawling back. She was so nervous. She got on stage, and she sat there with her cards, kind of shuffling them, and really wanted to stick to the cards and what she had so carefully written out. And she confessed to these powerful women in the room, mind over matter, I'm consumed by self-doubt. I just get through it by mind over matter. What a story, right? If Barbara Streisand is insecure, if Barbara Streisand is nervous about putting out her real self, as opposed to her singing self, then of course, it just shows how so many of us have self-doubts. It doesn't matter what level you're at. So I think it's something just to remember when you're feeling insecure about yourself, when you're feeling insecure about telling your own story, about being out front. There's the Barbara Streisand story. And it raises this question, why is it that women have so much trouble standing out front? We've heard a lot about that this morning and so much great advice. And there's a question of why that is, because we can talk about discrimination and men not behaving well and all that, but why is it that we don't have the confidence to put ourselves out? I think a lot of it has to come from within. And I think there is that legacy of us staying in the background, partly because of men and their perspectives, and I want to give you a little bit of perspective on that. There's a book about co-ed Ivy League colleges that just came out. Ivy League colleges didn't go co-ed, most of them, until the early 1970s. That's about when I was a preteen, confessing my age here. And here's what an influential Yale graduate wrote, because he was opposing this. Gentlemen, let's face it, charming as women are, they get to be a drag if you're forced to associate with them each and every day. Think of the poor student who has a steady date. He wants to concentrate on the basic principles of thermodynamics, but she keeps trying to gossip about the idiotic trivia all women try to impose on men. And I raised that because that wasn't that long ago that a lot of men thought that. And we've had enormous strides. I don't think it's hard to find somebody in business today among men that actually still thinks that. There may be some older generations, but generally that's, as we just heard, the millennial generation, which is the largest generation living today, is incredibly diverse. And I've got 2 grown sons, and they think nothing of working alongside. One's an Army Ranger, was alongside women, even now in combat. So I just wanted to offer some advice that I pick up from these Fortune Most Powerful Women Summits, from women who are in those C-suites and so on. And a lot of it, it's interesting, it echoes what we've heard here this morning. One of the things that came out last week at Laguna was this quote: "Choose to be relevant. Choose to be relevant. Assert yourself. Don't be that nice, forgettable woman in the room." I thought that was really well put. Second, focus on excellence today and your career goals tomorrow. Be the best at what you do now. And I was a journalist for 35 years, and in my business, excellence was right out front. It was right out on the. You either were a good writer and reporter, or you weren't. So there's a much more objective case to be made. Obviously, in business, it's about numbers, it's about vision, but it's also about asserting yourself and reminding people. I thought this morning when we talked about the awards that were given, that was incredible. That women don't think to assert themselves and point out that what they've done and what they should be rewarded for. So focus on excellence, but also focus on making people know about your excellence. Chelsea Handler was at our Laguna Beach event, and she wrote this letter to herself, and I thought it was really an important addition to this point about being excellent today. Don't expect immediate results with anything. Be patient. I know you hate hearing that, but seriously, be patient. Put in the time and the effort, and then wait for the reward. It will come. You won't be waiting tables forever. You will live out every dream you have and more. And then she wrote, flex your grit. Enjoy the struggles of the unknown, because you will have the life you've always dreamed of. And that brings us to number 3. And again, you've heard some of this here, but I really want to drive it home from those women who are sitting in the C-suites. Take risks and constantly expand your horizons. And I would say expand your intellectual horizons as well. I don't think this comes up enough. I encourage women to read newspapers. The Wall Street Journal and Fortune magazine are overwhelmingly male readerships. Know what's going on in the world. Listen to my podcast with CSIS. I have an iTunes podcast called Smart Women, Smart Power, which is all about geopolitics. If you want to be a visionary leader, you need to know what's going on in the world. But you also have to take risks. So this is a common piece of advice from CEOs we talk to. Every job you take should make you feel uncomfortable and kind of a little bit like you're not sure you can do it. IBM CEO Ginny Rometty encourages women to embrace discomfort. When did you ever learn the most? He asked people. When did you ever learn the most? I guarantee it's after you took a big risk. And this is interesting. Growth and comfort do not coexist. I've just made a big change and risk in my life after 35 years of being a journalist, writing for the Los Angeles Times, Fortune magazine, an award-winning column there. I've written a number of books. I mean, this has been my lifeblood. I stepped out with Patty Sellers. That was the last woman you heard early this morning, encouraging you to lean in. She and I started a company, Sellers Easton Media, and we decided to leave journalism and take our storytelling and narrative and interview skills directly to private clients. It was a big leap, big leap, but it's been so exciting and such an enormous opportunity for growth for both of us after so many years being in the same business, and it's been enormously fun and challenging. So I encourage all of you to take that next challenge, but also be open-minded about opportunity. Patty, again, who she invented Fortune Most Powerful Women, she always likes to say, view your life and career as a jungle gym, not a ladder. Be hyper-aware of the opportunities that come along over here and there. That opportunity could be lateral, and it could also be downward. So sometimes that opportunity is going to put you in a better position to move to where you want to be. Have confidence in your own story. Be authentic, be vulnerable, be relatable, and assume goodwill. So again, at Laguna Beach, Patty interviewed a woman who, her name's Diane Bryant. She's a VP, very top executive at Intel. She's been interviewed dozens of times. She's talked about the tech industry and so on. Patty did what we, both of us, like to do, is drill down on what really makes her tick, what is really behind her and her success. And she said something, she revealed something she's never revealed before. She grew up the daughter of a convicted convict. She spent her teenage years with her father in jail for armed robbery. And she grew up, she overcame that to be a top executive at Intel. I share that because I think it's really, we talked about vulnerability a little bit earlier, and not everybody has a story that's that dramatic, but I think it's really important to kind of know what your story is, know what your narrative is, know that it wasn't easy along the way, and admit it, because it helps the women coming up behind you. You know, once you make it, I think paying it back, or paying it forward, I should say, one way of doing that is telling your story. Great leaders weren't born that way. They faced great headwinds. They faced doubts, including self-doubts. And I think talking about that and sharing that provides great inspiration for the women coming up behind you. Of course, mentoring and sponsorship is really important, I think, for all of us as we move up the ranks. And it was interesting that we had one of the very top experts in the country on gender work relations at Laguna. And she said, women too often stand in harsh judgment of younger women coming up behind them. How many agree with that? I just think that's something that we need to look out for. And again, offer that hand to the person coming up behind you. It's easy to be discouraged and cynical. We have a business world run mostly by men, as Lauren showed the numbers. We've only got 24 female CEOs out of 500 companies, less than 5%. When you wonder, like, where's the female Mark Zuckerberg? They're hard to find. Men start companies to make a lot of money. Women tend to start companies because the kind of companies that they want to work for. And after the election on Tuesday, the number of women in both chambers remains stuck at 104. And again, Lauren brought up these numbers. That means women make up 19% of Congress overall. And I figure that puts us, I don't know what your number was. I have here 97 out of 193 countries. So I do my part to inspire women to embrace their inner leader. We can all be leaders. I'm an optimist at heart, and I firmly believe that women's stories of today, including yours, should and will be part of the narrative of women's leadership going forward into the future. It's going to be a narrative about innovation, change, and leaders, great leaders, leaders with vision, and leaders who want to make an impact. So please find your story, shout it out, pay it forward, and let it be a source of inspiration to others. Thanks.
Nina, one thing before you go. Just, can you pop back up? I'm sorry. I really appreciate how you were lovely in trying to help us get back on time. But I think there's one key thing, because I know you and what you do, that's really important to share with the group. And that's what Sellers Easton is focused on. Can you just talk about how powerful you think it is to be able to tell your personal story as well as your professional story, and a little bit about the work that you're doing in that space? Because then they can learn more about it in the breakout, but I really think it's important before you go to share that.
Thank you for letting me advertise my business, Mick. This is why we love her, right? So, Sellers Easton Media, it's basically a private storytelling company. Patty and I both believe that there are incredible stories of leaders out there that we want to tell. We take it directly to our clients, leaders in business, leaders in philanthropy, leaders of great families. There's tremendous opportunity to transmit. We heard this from the CEOs here today too. There's great need and desire, I think, to transmit core values, to transmit life lessons, and to in the case of a company, to stakeholders like employees, like customers, and like investors. And so by having the CEO, who is really kind of the chief storyteller in a company these days, kind of tell that story and be authentic, we are helping those leaders and companies do that. And then on the personal side, there's individuals and families who've done incredible things. They've, their grandparents or the parents have immigrated here against great odds. They've built companies against great odds, and now they're tremendously successful. And those stories aren't told. And what happens is that the people in generations below that lose that sense of that glue that holds them together about what the family story is. It wasn't easy. They weren't born that way. The great hardship and difficulties and hard decisions to make, and life lessons and core values. It's a way for families that have really made a mark in the world to pass down their values to next generations. Patty and I really believe in people in telling the stories of people where financial success isn't what it's all about. It's about making an impact. And you don't need traditional media to tell that story anymore. You've got this incredible digital environment where you can use non-traditional media, and we can help you tell that story on video, for example. It can live a video story of a family or a company or a person can live digitally on Facebook or on a private page, or just to show at an anniversary or a birthday event, some sort of milestone event. So it's a way to, and we also we do pictorial essay books. We do not do autobiographies. We've had to tell a lot of people we don't do memoirs and autobiographies. It's just not part of our business model. But we do, we interview people on film and intertwine it with vintage photography and B-roll and so forth to be able to tell a beautiful story about a company or about a family or the company that the family built and so on. So that's, does anybody else have any questions? And I look forward to continuing the conversation in the breakout. And we can talk more about storytelling. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I may have your attention, please join us upstairs in the City View Terrace room for lunch. Take the elevator or escalator to the right of this room when you exit to the 4th floor. We have been mindful in purposely not having a presentation during lunch so that you have time to network, and we invite you to continue the momentum and sit with someone new. This organization is all about building relationships. At 1 p.m., we will begin the afternoon session with Lauren in Stemmons B, and Nina will be in Stemmons A, located on the 3rd floor. During these sessions, you will have the opportunity to ask questions and participate in intimate conversations about the topics discussed this morning. Thank you for your attention. Enjoy your lunch.